Shalom, everyone, to Insights into the Weekly Haftorah. This week's Torah portion is the second in the book of Bamidbar, the book of Numbers. It's called Nasso. It is actually the longest Torah portion of the entire Torah, 176 verses. Many things happen in this Torah portion. One of them is the commandment and the instructions about a Nazir. And because of that, that is what was chosen to be the Haftorah, especially in a Torah portion that has many, many different incidents. It's not clear which incident will be matched with a Haftorah from the books of the prophets. In this case, it's the Nazir. A Nazir is someone who takes a vow to refrain from drinking wine and eating any product that comes from the grape. He or she grows their hair and cannot cut it during the time of the vow, and has to be very careful not to become impure, especially in contact with a dead body. So that is what the Torah portion tells us about a Nazir. The obvious question is why would someone want to become a Nazir? Wine in the Torah always represents the connection to pleasure, to the physical world, to getting personal pleasure, sometimes before anything else. So it became symbolic of a life of running after one's passions and desires. And the prophets talk about it in great length and many times, and obviously we have this until today, and it's a huge problem, where people overdrink. People become alcoholics and become tied to it, and it ruins people's lives. So the simple understanding is someone who needs to get a handle on their lives would take this vow to be a Nazir. So which Haftorah was chosen? It comes from the Book of Judges. It's the 13th chapter, the 2nd through 25th verse of the Book of Shoftim, the Book of Judges. And here we have the beginning of the story of Samson, Shimshon. And the Haftorah simply deals with the circumstances around the birth of Shimshon. The rest of the story continues in the Book of Judges, but for this Haftorah deals with how Shimshon was born. And as we're going to see, it was very unusual and miraculous. And it begins by saying that there was a man, Manoach. He was to be the father of Shimshon. And his wife is not named, but an angel comes to her and tells her that you have not had children to this point, but now you are going to have a son. And this son will be really unique in Jewish history, that he was a Nazir from the womb, meaning that the mother of Shimshon was already instructed by the angel not to become impure and not to eat anything from the grapes or to drink wine. So therefore, when she would become pregnant, she, in a certain way, would already have started his becoming a Nazir from the womb, in Hebrew, the beten. And there's no other person that it's mentioned like this. Most people take on this vow much later, One other person was a Nazir from birth, and that was Samuel, but not from the womb. In other words, Hannah, the mother of Samuel, was not instructed that she shouldn't drink wine or any grape product or become impure. So the angel comes and tells her. She goes back, and he also mentions that this son will begin to save Israel. Historically, the greatest enemy at the time of Israel were the Palestine, the Philistines. And they caused trouble for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. And it was being prophesied here that this son would begin to save Israel from the Philistines. For those who followed, we are learning the books of the prophets, and we went into great detail in the book of Judges. Here, I'm only going to deal with the birth of Shimshon. So what's very interesting is, why did the angel come to the wife of Manoach and not to Manoach? And so here we see a beautiful thing, that I'm pre-recording this class right before Shavuot. And in the Torah, it says that when God was preparing to give the Torah, starting from Rosh Chodesh Sivan until the giving of the Torah, there was a lot of back and forth between Moshe and God and instructions to the people. And God first spoke to the women and then afterwards to the men. And many reasons are given for this, that this was fixing what happened in the Garden of Eden, where God told Adam not to eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. But when he gave it over to his wife, Eve, he said, God has commanded us not to eat from the tree and not to touch it. And so he added something, and that led to a lot of problems, because the snake, understanding this, pushed Chava against a tree and said, look, nothing happened. Nothing happened. Nothing will happen if you eat from it either. Not only will nothing happen, but you'll be like God. And so it's brought down that at Sinai, which part of the whole story of giving the Torah was a fixing of what happened in the Garden of Eden, was God spoke first to the women. And that was part of the tikkun. So here, the angel comes first to the wife of Manoach. So she goes back and tells her husband, and her husband prays to God, please have this angel come again so we know how to raise this child. And so the angel comes again. But here I want to point out, if you look at the text, it's very ambiguous who this figure is and who Manoach and his wife thought it was, because in some places he's called a man of God. And in fact, the first time she says to her husband, a man of God came to me, and he appeared like an angel. So it's like she saw this awesome, righteous person who was, in her eyes, was so pure and so spiritual. He was like an angel. So first, he's called an Ish Elokim, a man of God. Later, the text says it was an angel of God. And then, even in another place, he's just called a man. And so here we see that from their perspective, Manoach and his wife, it wasn't completely clear who this individual was until the end, where he performs a miracle. After he comes back again, and he instructs them again, and this time with Manoach, there, Manoach offers to give him food. So he obviously thought he was a human being, even though an exalted human being who had appeared like an angel. And the angel said, no, but if you want to give a sacrifice to God, that's your business, but I'm not going to eat from what you give, which was a hint that he was an angel. So Manoach prepares it like an offering to God. And then it says that the angel, when the fire on the altar rose up, the angel rose up in the flame. And at that point, they understood this was an angel of God. This was an angel of God. So much so that Manoach said, we're going to die because we've seen an angel of God. But his wife, who was obviously very smart, and again, perhaps that's why the angel first came to her. Now, obviously, she was going to be the one to give birth to the child, and she had to already take upon herself some of the commandments of a Nazir. But she said to Manoach, she said, if God wanted us to die, he wouldn't have come and told us all of this and that we're going to have a child, which was kind of an obvious thing. Manoach was very emotional, and he probably was, in a certain way, had awe and fear that he had seen an angel of God. But his wife was very down to earth, very practical, and said, obviously, God wants us to live because we have to give birth to this child. So this idea has many, many different angles, but we know later, after this event, the whole story of Elijah the prophet, who rose up to heaven in a fiery chariot and became an angelic being. That's why all the stories of Eliyahu appearing in different guises in different generations to different people it's reminiscent of this story. And we also know that Hanoch, who is in the 7th generation from Adam, it says that God took him. And according to tradition, he was also became an angelic being. So, and we're also reminded of the story of the 3 men who came to Avram. Now, they were angels, but at first, Avram thought they were actually pagans. And as he always did, he made a feast for them and tried to bring them close to the idea of one God. In the end, he realizes that they're angels. They revealed themselves as angels. So here we see that sometimes there's a very fine line between a man of God and angel. And in fact, the sages say that if your rabbi or rebbe or spiritual guide does not appear to you like an angel, find someone else. In other words, there has to be like an aspect of an angelic energy to one's spiritual guide. There, of course, is much more to say, but one can go back into the Book of Judges and see the whole story of Shimshon. You can also access on YouTube our whole series on the Book of Judges, where we spent many, many weeks discussing Shimshon. But this is the Haftorah for the Parsha of Nasso.